everybody, good evening and welcome. I'm Castle de Graaf from 2NQ, and this is the fourth Finsbury Park Heritage Talk, I'm delighted to say. This Heritage Talk is part of the People and Heritage Programme, which is supported by the National Lottery Heritage Fund and Haringey Council. There are a number of other elements to that programme. There was the Adventure Learning Programme in local schools, which we completed before the lockdown. There's also a Safe Space Art Workshop for local residents, which is currently ongoing, I'm pleased to say. We have community meetings to discuss arts and culture events. And last year we did a photographic exhibition, which led to a great deal of feedback, including many more heritage stories about Finsbury Park. And we're currently in the process of creating a bigger, better exhibition, both for offline and we hope, both for online and we hope also in the park itself. Previous heritage talks that we've had in this series included the history of people's parks with the author Travis Elborough. We did that in January, and many of you may have been there in Finsbury Park Cafe, which sadly currently is closed. The following month in February, we also did another talk in the Finsbury Park Cafe, and that was about objects found in the park during the 150th anniversary year, which, as we all know, was 2019. And that was part of a contemporary archaeology project, which we did together with our partners at the Museum of London. And then about 10 days before the lockdown, we just managed to squeeze another one in March. And that was when Professor Krista Cowman from the University of Lincoln came and talked to us about the suffragettes and particularly their presence in Finsbury Park, which was a great symbol and story about the radical heritage of this People's Park. So now I'm really delighted to welcome Dr. Paul Jackson from the University of Northampton. Paul is the author of Hitler's Echo, about Colin Jordan and the British neo-Nazis, a fantastic book. So he knows not only about the period of which we speak tonight, but also some of its resonance later on, which I wouldn't be surprised will come up perhaps during the talk and during the questions afterwards. So welcome to Finsbury Park, Paul, virtually. Very much looking forward to what you've got to say. So over to you.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much. I'll just say a few words about myself, I think, first, and then I'll try and share some PowerPoint slides and we'll go through the talk. But I mean, first of all, Casper, I mean, thank you for inviting me. I think it's always a real pleasure to be able to do these sorts of talks, and it was obviously a real shame that we couldn't do it live. And one of the things that I was hoping to do was to be able to get to Finsbury Park, which I'm not super familiar with before the talk, and be able to kind of relate things to the talk as I went through it. But obviously I'm not going to be able to do that, despite the lovely pictures of Finsbury Park that you were playing beforehand. But I'm going to try my best to relate what I've got to say to Finsbury Park a little bit more specifically as we go through. But as I say, I just thought I'd say a couple of words about myself, so you kind of got a sense of who's talking to you, because I think that's really helpful. I'm a historian. I work at the University of Northampton. And in particular, as Casper says, I'm very interested in the history of fascism, in Britain. There's been quite a lot written over the years about the history of fascism in the interwar period, which is what I'm going to focus on. But my real kind of interest, area of interest, is things after the Second World War, 60s, 70s, 80s, National Front, things like the British National Party as well. And also I do work about the contemporary extreme right in various ways too. So I've created training packages for police forces, for example, and run training events at the university around aspects of the far right for people who encounter it professionally and that sort of thing. And also curate an archive that we got at the University of Northampton, created by an anti-fascist organisation. It's going to be bits about anti-fascism in the talk as well, called Searchlight, and that's been going since the 1960s, and it's created a huge archive of all sorts of material related to studying the extreme right, and it's really useful that we have that at the university now. And lots of academics are using it, but not right now, because obviously we're in lockdown and you can't get access to an archive in lockdown, but hopefully we'll be able to open that up again at some point soon. So, as I say, that's a little bit about me, and that might, feed into what you want to talk to me about in the question and answer session as well. So, although this is primarily a history talk about the interwar years, probe me for questions if you want to know about other aspects of the far right, especially in Britain. And I think also just one more thing before I kind of start properly. For me, this is the first talk that I've given in any sort of way since we've seen the growth. It's certainly not the beginning of it because it began many years ago, but the growth of the Black Lives Matter protests, which I think have been a really kind of striking aspect of the whole lockdown period and the kind of the changed politics of it. And it's also a movement that I'm kind of very much in agreement with. And I kind of look around my field of academia, and it's very white, and there's a lot of white privilege around, and it's a real problem. I'm not necessarily going to address that super directly in the talk, but it's just something that I think is worth saying, and I'm very conscious of as I'm kind of developing work in an area which is all about the history of race, and so on and so forth. So I take quite a sort of in a way, I suppose, what might seem like relatively breezy walk through aspects of British fascism, but we shouldn't, which I think is useful to do as a historian, because you kind of want to understand the past. But I mean, we shouldn't lose the sight of the fact that the people we're talking about in this talk are often really unpleasant, really nasty figures in various ways. So I'm sort of well aware of that, but I'm trying to sort of present, as I say, a kind of a walk-through aspect of the British extreme right with this. I kind of titled this talk "Finsbury Park and the Radical Past: Fascism and Anti-fascism," and I want to talk a bit about fascism and anti-fascism in the interwar period. Talk a bit about some of the main movements, some of the more minor ones in various ways as well, and also try to relate this to a particular march of the British Union of Fascists in Finsbury Park, shortly before another important event in the history of these movements, the Battle of Cable Street as well, which I'll also talk about. And then I'll kind of try to wind things up, and then we can have a kind of a Q&A discussion as well. And one more thing before I get going proper. My kind of previous visit to the Finsbury Park area came a few years ago, just after a kind of a terrorist attack in Finsbury Park Mosque. I was asked by the BBC to be a kind of an academic talking head on BBC Breakfast a couple of days after the Finsbury Park Mosque attack. So as I say, what I want to kind of talk a bit about is the nature of British fascism and the nature of anti-fascism too, which I think was the sort of the brief of this talk, and to kind of give you a kind of a sense perhaps of how academics study British fascism and anti-fascism, and say try and relate this to Finsbury Park too, and also kind of have this question running through it that hopefully we can pick up in the Q&A session as well. What is legitimate protest against racist organisations, and what is things that might be provoking them in unwanted ways and maybe creating problems and making the situation worse? And there's no clear answer to those sorts of questions, so I'm not going to give you all the answers to that, but it's a running kind of ambiguity that we can think about. But first of all, I just kind of want to talk a little bit about the nature of fascism, as it were, and the ways in which we, as historians at least, think about fascism these days, because it's often quite different from how the media talk about it too. I mean, one of the first points is that fascism is often described as something that's an alien form of politics to Britain. The British don't really like the extremisms of fascism, and that doesn't really seem to sort of bear a huge amount of weight. I mean, I think it's very correct to say that fascism is far less popular in Britain, but it's often the kind of particular historical circumstances that make fascism popular, not whether a country's culture is naturally alien or suited to it. Nazism seemed really alien and extreme to lots of Germans, for example. So, we don't now kind of talk about fascism as being an alien form of politics. And what we do see fascism is as well, it's not just about, sort of demeaning people or being very racist as well. What seems to motivate people and attract people to fascist movements, past and present, is that they offer as part of their kind of politics. Part of their politics is very racist, but part of their politics is also a kind of a vision of an alternate modern world, a way in which the world can be fundamentally different, regenerated, reborn, and created anew. You know, think about the 1,000-Year Reich of Hitler, for example. It's a kind of a classic instance of a kind of a fascist vision of the new coming from a state of great crisis in the world, as fascists see it. So we often see fascist politics as kind of gravitating around these kind of descriptions of the world around us as being in kind of great crisis, and the fascists present their politics as appealing because they alone have the solution to it and can give and create a new world. And a historian called Dan Stone wrote a book called Breeding Superman, which was all about the kind of the wide milieu in early 20th century Britain that included things like Kibu Kift as well, broadly speaking, where radical extreme ideas, some of them fascist, some of them other things, eugenics would have been part of that as well, were all kind of creating these alternate visions. And that's really what fascism is rooted in. And we find those cultures across Europe in the early 20th century and late 19th century, and each national fascism emerges from that. A wider kind of intellectual culture. And fascism's normal state, therefore, is to be small-scale, marginalised, pretty much what we see in the UK through most of the 20th century. It's only in very unusual situations that it actually gets anywhere, like with Italy and Germany. So as I say, again, historians of fascism don't see Germany and Italy as necessarily typical. They're in many ways atypical, unusual examples of fascism, because they actually got off the ground and got somewhere. So, you know, those are some sort of broad brushstrokes about how historians think about fascism. And anti-fascism as well is kind of becoming something that historians at least are more interested in. There's often been an anti-fascist culture in the 20th century, and it's kind of created its own documentation in various ways. But there's a growing area of study of anti-fascism. And one of the leading figures here is a historian, is a professor at Teesside University called Nigel Copsey. And he sees anti-fascism as a many and varied thing. You know, it might be, you know, sort of militant protesters on the streets and that sort of thing, but it could be many other things. He argues that there can be left-wing, liberal, conservative forms of anti-fascism. It can take many forms. And really what it requires somebody to do is consciously identify as anti-fascist and see that by consciously attacking fascism in some way, maybe through writing, maybe through street demonstrations, through all sorts of different activities, they're trying to defeat what they see fascism to be, and they're trying to defend liberal democratic principles, broadly speaking, as well. There are other historians working in this area as well. David Renton is another very interesting figure who's written on things like the Rock Against Racism movement. He'd be a good one to invite for one of these talks, to be honest with you. I'm sure he'd have lots to say. And he knows London very well. So it's a kind of a growing area of study as anti-fascism, including in the interwar period. So there you've got a book co-edited by Copsey, Varieties of Anti-Fascism, Britain in Britain in the interwar period. And also anti-fascisms are very international as well. They're very connected with fascisms here and fascisms there, and they're all about opposing fascism wherever they see it, and see this as very internationalist, very different to fascists, therefore. So, you know, in the interwar period, for example, we see the phrase "no partisan," or "they shall not." No, passaran, sorry, they shall not pass, circulate widely across anti-fascist cultures across Europe, originating from Spain during the Spanish Civil War. And so, as I say, we see forms of anti-fascism develop. One of the key moments in British anti-fascism was the Battle of Cable Street at the end of October, at the end of 1936, October 1936, and I'll come back to that a little later on. So, as I say, the study of anti-fascism and the study of fascism are both things that historians are very interested in, and often what we find is that what we've got to say is quite different from what people in the kind of the press and the media have to say as well, which often makes it fun when I have chats with journalists and things about the nature of the extreme right in various ways. I thought I'd give you a little whistle-stop tour of some of the main British fascist movements of the 1930s before getting onto the BUF as well. Because again, you know, there's a kind of a problem with memory that it focuses just on one group or one organization. You kind of forget the kind of the complexity of all of this. And there's also interesting, Caspar, that you said that one of the kind of previous talks was talking about suffragettes as well. So this hopefully will be an interesting segue for you all in that sense, because the first kind of consciously fascist organisation in Britain was founded in 1923 by Rotha Linton Orman, and she was a very interesting figure. She'd worked as a nurse during the First World War. She'd been influenced by, you know, sort of radical feminist politics of that period, and many others, especially who were attracted to British fascism at this time, went through a kind of a pathway from suffragettes to seeing something positive in forms of fascism. As I say, seeing in that kind of alternate vision of how society could be, an alternate way of women's experiences being. And one of the key historians here is somebody called Julie Gottlieb, another really good historian, a great public historian as well, done lots of kind of talks around this sort of area. So Caspar, maybe another to put on your list. As I say, I mean, she coined this term feminine fascism for the amount of women who got attracted to British fascism in the interwar period. And to be clear, I mean, they could be being activists right alongside the kind of super misogynistic male fascists as well. So there was a very kind of complex gender politics within all of this. Another good historian of fascism and gender, Martin Durham, has written a lot about this in Britain and abroad. But as I say, I flag up the British fascists, who were kind of let's say, Britain's first fascist organisation in various ways. They took the slogan, the kind of the acronym BF as well, and led to them soon being dubbed the Bloody Fools by many, which also has a BF as the title as well. So they were quite a small group, attracting membership in the low thousands at best. Again, they were kind of very engaged with the kind of emerging anti-fascist politics of the period too, notably in March 1925. I think this was following and taking inspiration for an assassination attempt on Mussolini in Italy. They kidnapped the leader of the Communist Party of Great Britain, Harry Pollitt. For example, it was later released, and it was all sort of done in a relatively English and gentlemanly way. But there was that sort of fascist, anti-fascist politics emerging in the 1920s. They were developing some more radical splinter groups. Here, for example, something called the National Fasci was developed and led by somebody called William Joyce, and also another figure called Arnold Leese, two of whom I'll come back to later. And the British fascists also were divided over how to engage with the general strike in 1926 as well, whether to act as strike breakers or not, and be able to offer their services to the government in various ways, cause them problems. So, as I say, I give you the British fascists as a sort of an exemplar of an early interwar fascist group. I'm not going to read all of this out, but they kind of created stuff for kids as well. This is a kind of some verses from a 5-verse thing that they call the Fascist Children's Creed. And if you kind of just pick out a few of the kind of the key words coming through that, there's a kind of a lot of sense of loyalty to the crown, loyalty to God, and empire, and so on and so forth. So really this was a kind of a pro-empire, radical, kind of conservative group than a properly fascist group ultimately. But as I say, it also kind of was an incubator for more extreme figures who developed further into the 1930s. There are others who were quite interesting figures bobbing around in the 1920s too. Somebody called James Barnes, for example, was central to an organisation that was funded by Mussolini's Italy called the Centre International d'études sur le Fascisme, or CINEF, which is a sort of a fascist think tank of the late 20s and early 30s to try and develop some sort of universal fascism for exporting fascism in other countries. It's a very interesting organisation, and Barnes was a very interesting figure in various ways. And he wrote books as well. And if you kind of read the book's reviews in the Times, the late 1920s, you kind of pick up the sense that even in the late 20s, in fact, in Britain, fascism wasn't necessarily seen as a bad thing if it was for the Italians and it was sorting Italy out. It wasn't necessarily seen as a thing for Britain in that kind of mainstream press. But there certainly wasn't necessarily a particularly negative view of fascism per se. So Barnes was quite an interesting figure. Some of the kind of the more hardline and sort of particularly nasty figures connected with fascism in this period also included somebody called Henry Hamilton Beamish, who created something called the Britain's Publishing Society, and this was really an ultra anti-Semitic organization. It published things like the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, which, if you know your anti-Semitic conspiracy theories cultures, is the kind of the preeminent central document for a lot of that. If Hitler in Mein Kampf ever cites any source to back up any of his arguments, it's always the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, for example. It's a very important and totally fictitious text claim there's a global Jewish conspiracy. So Beamish's Britain's Publishing Society published that and lots of other anti-Semitic material. So that's kind of part of British fascist culture of this period. And there's various others. I'll go through a few more in a second. But there was, as I say, broadly speaking, although quite marginal, there was quite a diverse range of groups and organizations promoting fascist themes in Britain already in the 1920s, and these only grew in the 1930s. Again, as I say, the BUF is the one that everybody remembers, and I will come to that and talk a bit about them in Finsbury Park too. But just whilst you're sort of waiting for that, and probably I'm testing your patience a little bit, there's just one other that's really important to talk about a little bit as well, if you want to know your interwar British fascist groups, and that's something called the Imperial Fascist League. And again, this is a very interesting organization. It was created by the guy in the picture, Arnold Leese. And he was a kind of a man coming from the British Empire. He'd been a vet. He'd written a kind of a key textbook on the illnesses of camels, for example. So he was already kind of a professional man with a previous career, and so he sort of came to fascism a little later in life and created this organization. He was interested in various, as I say, these kind of radical ideas of how a different world could be. And he was in particular interested in a radical economic program called social credit. So to link back to Kibbo Kift for a second or two, they also became interested in social credit, which broadly speaking was a very kind of complex alternate economic system, a bit like Marxism proposes communism, an alternative economic system for a modern world. So social credit tried to offer, again, a fundamentally different economic system to the capitalism of the period. So there's something more complex going on with the Imperial Fascist League in these sorts of senses. It's trying to offer people a new and different type of economy as part of its message and narrative. So as I say, this is one of the reasons why historians see this as more clearly fascist as opposed to the British fascists of the 1920s. It was also really interested in the anti-Semitic theories and the biological anti-Semitism coming out of Nazi Germany, and much more so than Mosley was with the British Union of Fascists too. This kind of organization was animated by anti-Semitism, and it was at its very core. It was a very small organization, membership really in the hundreds, but it didn't see itself as a large-scale organization anyway. Leese saw us as creating what he saw as a kind of a new elite of Jew-wise, people who were fully on board with all the kind of the details of this anti-Semitic conspiracy theory stuff. And it was also closely connected with people like Beamish's Britain's Publishing Company too. And I flagged this up as kind of quite impactful, not necessarily because it was as impactful as Mosley's British Union of Fascists, but because in terms of establishing a neo-Nazi culture in Britain throughout the 20th century, it's Leese who everybody remembers. You know, people like Nick Griffin have been influenced by Leese's ideas. Go back a generation, people like John Tyndall of the National Front, would have been influenced by his ideas, as were people like Colin Jordan of the National Socialist movement in the 1960s and so on. Britain's neo-Nazi movement has never been huge, it's always been very marginal, but as I say, this is the originator figure of it. So contemporary neo-Nazis and contemporary neo-Nazisms are rooted in this man's writings and ideas. And also American neo-Nazis are also very interested in him too. You can find his books being sold in sort of rather obscure neo-Nazi magazines of the kind of the Midwest in America of the 1970s or what have you, for example, because he articulated Nazi themes in English language. It means that he's had a kind of a very long life, and he's very central to as I say, cultures of anti-Semitism, especially neo-Nazism, throughout the 20th century. Thankfully, these cultures are marginal, but nevertheless, he has an important role to play. Mosley, of course, is the kind of the key figure of the 20th of the interwar period in terms of British fascist figures, and his profile is perhaps more typically of a kind of a successful fascist leader. He could capture a kind of a genuine sense of charismatic aura around him, and like many, there was a particular generation of people who had experienced the First World War in one way or another. Either they'd been a little bit too young to fight in the First World War, or they had experiences of fighting and combat in some form or another during the war that gave them a kind of a romanticized and positive sense of what sort of these kind of masculine values of war were all about. And also the war gave them a sense that the modern world had become corrupted in some way. And so a new world needed to emerge from the chaos of the First World War as they saw it. And you can find those themes in Mussolini, you can find those themes in Hitler, you can find them in lots of other fascist leaders of the interwar period, and you can find them in Mosley as well. He served in the Royal Flying Corps during the First World War. He's quite a privileged figure coming from the upper classes, which is relatively unusual for fascist leaders, but fascism can appeal across the classes ultimately. And again, he kind of left the First World War with this desire to find a new type of politics. He didn't start off so radical. He started off in a kind of relatively straightforward vein, became a Conservative MP for Harrow, married the daughter of the Foreign Secretary, and so on. But he was also very interested in some of the radical ideas that were floating around in that kind of extremes of Englishness, alternative culture. He moved to the Labour Party in the mid-1920s, became more interested in the kind of the ideas of John Maynard Keynes around, sort of solving economic crisis through big state spending on big projects and that sort of thing. So there was a growing radicalism in him there. And eventually he left the Labour Party by 1930, 1931, sorry, and dubbed the mainstream politics in Britain the old gang. So you get this kind of typically fascist sense that all mainstream politicians are the same, they're all corrupt, we need a radical alternative. And so he was venturing into a properly fascist space by this point. His first venture here was something called the NUPA, or the New Party, which was also formed in 1931, and was quite influenced by continental fascism already, but it didn't necessarily have all the qualities of offering a fascist revolution, as we later find with the BUF itself. It contested the 1931 general election, was comprehensively rejected by the electorate, and this kind of dwindled relatively quickly thereafter. And then capturing, or trying to capture that kind of wider fascist fringe that I've already described, we find him forming the British Union of Fascists, which tried to bring all these different kind of disparate elements together to create a unified form of fascism for 30s Britain. And we find this kind of develop again at the end of the 1960s. The National Front drew together various smaller groups to try and create one organization that was then shot through with all sorts of internal conflicts and problems. Not everybody joined the British Union of Fascists. Arnold Leese, for example, decided that Mosley and his organization was really part of the Jewish conspiracy, would have nothing to do with it. There's the kind of, there's a Monty Python-esque quality to a lot of this, which I'm not necessarily going to kind of diminish too much. So we find the British Union of Fascists emerging. Initially, it had a degree of support. I can't go through a talk on 1930s British Union of Fascist Politics without at least quickly flagging up that the Daily Mail once ran a headline, "Hurrah for the black shirts." And this came at a time where the BUF really was at its height, 50,000 members by 1934. As I say, it's interesting to think about its nature and its life in various ways. And so there's been various historians who've kind of done a lot of work on it in various ways. Another to flag up, somebody called Michael Spur, and he wrote an article called "Living the Black Shirt Life" in a journal called Contemporary European History. It's a really fascinating piece, and he kind of talks about how politically it was a failure. I mean, it achieved no kind of political impact, didn't get anybody elected, useless in that regard. But in terms of creating a kind of a fascist counterculture in 1930s Britain, the BUF had a much greater success. It was able to create branches and clubs and societies in various parts of the countries and kind of create a kind of a, as I say, a kind of a counterculture promoting fascist ideology, but with very kind of overt and specific British reference points, genuinely British fascism, not simply a European import. Another who's, as I say, I've mentioned her already, but Julie Gottlieb likens Mosley almost to like a kind of a precursor to kind of the counterculture of the 1960s, almost like, but not really, like, say, a Mick Jagger figure, sort of somebody who parents and people in authority would frown on, but had a bit of an allure of the dangerous about him in various ways too. So, sort of historians have kind of commented on the BUF, as I say, in these sorts of terms: a political failure, but a very interesting effort to create British fascism with some, as I say, genuine ability to create a British fascist culture. As I say, 1934 was an important year for the BUF. It was growing in support. It was capturing, albeit briefly, some mainstream media, sort of positive publicity as well. It was able to capture some people's imagination through its kind of projection of an alternate economic future for Britain, which was one of the most well-developed of the economic sort of proposals of all the fascist organizations of Europe at the interwar period. So it was very kind of deeply into its ideology in various ways. But by 1934, we see incidents, and again, this brings back the anti-fascist element, like a rally in Olympia in June 1934, where Mosley had a mass demonstration, a mass kind of opportunity to address people at the Olympia arena in London. And this meeting was infiltrated by anti-fascist campaigners. There are anti-fascists outside as well. And these were very violently, sort of expelled from the meeting by BUF stewards. And this led to a lot of bad publicity for the BUF at this point. Also, there was a growing public awareness in Britain after the rise of Nazism, and certainly by 1934, of just how violent and aggressive fascism could be. So that kind of culture of the late 20s, which was more accepting or interested in fascism that I mentioned earlier, well, this had changed by this point. By this point, with Nazism in power, there was a much more negative perception of what fascism was all about. So all of this meant that the BUF was falling on much harder times after 1934. It became more interested in promoting anti-Semitic conspiracy theories as well, to try and capture, sort of greater support by tapping into this prejudice that, could be found in sort of parts of London, for example, and other parts of Britain as well. So its anti-Semitism was less straightforwardly the same as Nazism's anti-Semitism, I should add. If you get into kind of studying this, you see that people develop their anti-Semitic ideas in different ways, which makes them incompatible with each other. Mosley's idea of anti-Semitism was more around a Jewish culture rather than biologically rooted in Jewish, sort of bodies, as it were, that you found in Arnold Leese's form of anti-Semitism. All of this is, sort of relatively grim as you kind of study this stuff and go through and try to have to make various variants of how people construct their prejudices. But it is important to draw out because they frame how groups might interact or not with each other. I did promise that I'd bring this to Finsbury Park eventually, and now I'm going to do that because, as I say, we can see that the BUF visited Finsbury Park during this kind of mid-30s period where the BUF, as I say, was turning to more overtly anti-Semitic politics to try and develop a role for itself. And as I say, so we see it coming to Finsbury Park in 1936, in June 1936 indeed. And this incident, or this rally, led to questions being raised in the House of Commons about what to do with the BUF and also what to do with anti-fascist protest. As well. So I'll read a little bit here from Frederick Montague, Labour MP for Islington West, and he addressed the Home Secretary and asked if he was aware of a BUF demonstration to, quote, with police cars, lorries and ambulance wagons, a refreshment tent erected in the children's playground, and whether he's aware that the only violence exhibited was that of Sir Oswald Mosley's supporters, that the demonstration was organised in military fashion with uniformed men and appropriately distinguished officers, that military formations were conducted and military orders given by loudspeakers, although loudspeakers were perfectly peaceful, rival meetings were ordered to be toned down, and whether he will take steps to see that while safeguarding free speech, so extremely provocative private army organisations are forbidden in future. So I think that was a really interesting kind of question coming from the Labour Party there. As I say, really kind of painting one picture here. Certainly we kind of get an interesting perspective of the protest. I've got some photos that I'm going to cycle through as we go through this, but we also get a sense that, this issue, the police are siding with the fascists, they're urging the fascists, their opportunity to free speech, they're a dangerous militaristic organisation, and anti-fascist opposition was silenced. So that was one thing coming through. Home Secretary John Simon replied, I'm informed by the Commissioner of Police in the Metropolis that 573 foot police and 59 mounted police were on the ground. So large a number of police was employed because the police had reason to believe from past experience that the presence of fascists and anti-fascists in the park, unless adequately policed, was likely to give rise to disorder and breaches of the peace. The precautions taken by the police were both necessary and adequate, and no disorder occurred except for a minor scuffle on the outskirts of the fascist meeting, as a result of which 2 persons wearing badges of the fascist party were arrested and charged with using insulting words and behaviour. And he kind of went on to add, I'll come back to that in just a second because it kind of underscores the point. The House will appreciate how difficult the task of the police is when rival organisations demonstrate in the same locality. Whilst it is the duty of the police to deal with any conduct which is likely to lead to breaches of the peace, such drastic measures as those proposed by the Honourable Member would require legislation and, at the present, I'm advised, I'm not satisfied that there is sufficient ground for proposing so far-reaching a change in the law. So here you get a very different tone. It's not really the fascists who are ultimately the problem, although some were arrested. It's those pesky counter-protesters who are coming up and causing all the problems for the police to deal with this issue of fascists. And to combat fascism would require legislation to stop militaristic organizations from, and that just wasn't acceptable as we can see, in the midpoint of 1936. So we can kind of see some interesting issues here at play around who is, who has the right to free speech, what is acceptable in terms of protest, how do we kind of understand what threatening as behavior is from an organization and so on. And so we can sort of see all of these playing out. And this also I found just on the internet. I think this comes from the Islington and Holloway Press. I'm not fully sure of the full provenance here, but and it'd be nice to have more access to archives to dig all of this out. But as I say, often when studying fascism, I find that local press can be quite, sort of sympathetic towards far-right views in various ways and quite critical of radical left views. So this doesn't surprise me necessarily. So to read out, it's not perfect there. We have no sympathy for the black shirts, but it is our opinion that the fascists' meeting would have been peaceful if there had been no counter-demonstration. So again, it's this interesting, sort of framing. It's the anti-fascists who are ultimately causing the problem, and the fascists who are kind of unpleasant but should be tolerated. And as I say, if we kind of look to some of the wider literature around this as well, we can find this picked up by historians. The book author is just missing from that picture, actually. I apologize for that, but it's somebody called Daniel Tillis. And he has written about Jewish responses to British fascism in the 1930s. And he's a little bit disputed in the literature and a little bit more widely as well for these sorts of arguments, claims that anti-fascist responses are often creating more problems for Jewish communities and making life more difficult in giving fascists more opportunities to publicize their cause. He's written quite critically, for example, of the demonstrations around the Battle of Cable Street, which came a little later in 1936. And here we see, again, it was motivated by anti-Semitism. The British Union of Fascists develop a march in the East End area. It was about 7,000 strong in terms of BUF members, and there were tens of thousands of anti-fascists of all different varieties who turned out, communists, Jewish communities, and so on and so forth. Say police had to break up the event. The BUF march couldn't happen in the end. There was rioting and so on. And this did lead to change in the law as well. This led to the passing of something called the Public Order Act of 1936, which did all those things that the Labour MP was asking, or a lot of them at least. It forbidded the use of uniformed political movements and various other limitations on the kind of the paramilitary elements of the BUF's politics as well. So, you know, again, I'm not going to answer the question, but it's interesting to see, you know, are these kind of demonstrations creating opportunities for the fascists to present themselves as victim and develop support for themselves, or are they ultimately leading to opportunities where a crisis is seen and a change in the law occurs that makes the situation more difficult for fascists? It's complicated and it's not a simple, straightforward answer. It's quite an interesting question to think about the effectiveness or otherwise of anti-fascist activism of these sorts. As I say, just to kind of bring this kind of survey, the interwar period, to a sort of a close, and just say a few final words too, we find that the BUF does reframe itself in the very late 1930s, again in quite an interesting way, which reveals its kind of anti-Semitic prejudices as well. It campaigned against the idea of there being a new war with Germany. Dubbed this a Jew war, amongst other things, for example, which obviously reveals its anti-Jewish prejudices quite clearly. And it was able to grow again in size, and various forms of anti-Semitism, not just the fascist anti-Semitism, were able to grow at this point as they can chime in with wider appeasement cultures too. Again, Julie Gottlieb, somebody who's written quite interestingly on this. And then once the Second World War does break out, despite Mosley advising that Britain should never enter into a new world war with Germany, we find that soon all the kind of the main British fascist organisations are largely crushed through something called Defence Regulation 18B, which saw around 1,500 people connected with British fascism interned. Historians used to pretty much say that this was the kind of the complete destruction of British fascist cultures at this time. Although a new book came out recently, which is again very interesting if you're into all of this stuff, by somebody called Richard Griffiths, called "What Did You Do During the War?" Which was all about the ways in which elements of not necessarily overtly fascist, but kind of Nazi sympathizing radical right-wingers were able to develop various organizations during the Second World War, protesting and developing a politics more around anti-war than pro-fascism, but the sympathy was there. The British People's Party, for example, is one organisation that fits into this. And then in the post-war period, you find people floating into the British People's Party and then becoming more radicalised as they develop their cultures. You know, sort of fascism develops not through one group, but through myriad groups. And seeing these interconnections gets super complicated, but it's really interesting to see. Another figure, and this was just my other way to relate this back to Finsbury Park a little bit actually, who became more significant during the war period was William Joyce. He'd been in the British Union of Fascists, but really his anti-Semitism was more of the kind of the Nazi biological style rather than the kind of the Mosley, more Jewishness as a cultural phenomenon style. And he left the BUF in the later 30s, created his own organisation called the National Socialist League, and eventually, just before the war broke out, fled to Germany and became a broadcaster. He broadcast from Germany in the English language during the Second World War. The British press hated him and loved him. They dubbed him Lord Haw Haw, and he was much listened to and much derided, but it caused fear as well. So it was a kind of a mixed picture around him. It's a very interesting figure. But again, I just found this quote as well from somebody called Harold Smith, an anti-fascist campaigner, talking about Joyce back in his BUF days. I heard William Joyce speak in Finsbury Park once. A good speaker, abusive in his rasping voice. He just came to annoy and taunt the crowd. And as I say, that's kind of what he did that in Finsbury Park in the interwar years. And then he did that, you know, to Britain via Germany's broadcasting techniques during the Second World War as well. So William Joyce is another interesting figure here. As I say, he was captured. He was shot in the bottom after the Second World War, just after the Second World War, captured and put on trial in Britain for treason. It was sort of like a mini Nuremberg for Britain in some ways. And, you know, as I say, this is just 1 or 2 seconds really, but fascism and anti-fascism continued in Britain after 1945. And this is really more the stuff I study and research. But you know, we've seen loads of different organisations. Some of these were large, such as the National Front or the British National Party, which historians and academics at least see as a fascist party, genuinely so. Lots of more were kind of tiny organisations. Some are forgotten. National Socialist Group, for example, nobody much remembers. Some have been very recent. National Action and various kind of groups related to it, for example, prescribed under terrorism legislation fairly recently, but they were kind of very much rooted in Britain's neo-Nazi cultures and a kind of a very interesting product of it. Anti-fascism in Britain has also grown at various points, often in response to growths and sparks in British fascism. So Searchlight magazine, for example, is something that developed especially from the mid-1970s in response to the rise of the National Front, and has been going ever since, and runs moles or has run moles in fascist organisations and try and expose them in various ways. It's done lots of very interesting kind of grassroots investigative reporting in various ways. Rock Against Racism movement as well is another important aspect of the anti-fascist cultures in Britain. And most recently, an organisation called Hope Not Hate as well, do a lot of interesting work in this area of commenting on the fascists and the extreme right in Britain. And again, you know, sort of some people, maybe Donald Trump would fall into this category, see anti-fascism and fascism as part of the same coin. But really, this for historians like me who kind of work in this, I mean, we see them as fundamentally different. You know, both can be radical, maybe both can get people out onto the streets, but there is something fundamentally different about the fascist and the extreme right that campaigns on agendas that are racist and hierarchical and discriminatory, and anti-fascist, which pretty much always are campaigning on agendas that, at least in their minds, are related to themes of promoting democracy and pluralism and so on and so forth. So they might share aspects of radicalism, they might do things violently and aggressively that we dislike, but there are fundamental qualitative differences between fascists and anti-fascists, and that's also really important to stress, and hopefully I've been able to draw that out a little bit. So as I say, I think I'll wind things up there for now. So thank you for listening, and any questions?
So Paul, thank you very much indeed. That was absolutely fascinating. Can I say somewhat scary as well. Now we do have time for some audience questions. I'll just throw in a question to you, Paul. It's very interesting how you were talking about fascism being, shall we say, nationally and nationalism focused, and anti-fascism being more international. Of course, on the fascist side, there always also have been international alliances, as you were talking about CNEF and other similar things. I'm just wondering how that relates to today when you look at Farage and Aaron Banks and Steve Bannon and Marine Le Pen and Viktor Orban, Geert Wilders, that kind of grouping of people who are nationalist but trying to organize themselves around anti-Muslim, nationalist and racist kind of ideas, and whether, if you look at those, when you listen to Mosley talking about the old gang, are you hearing the same when you talk when you hear Trump talking about the swamp and when you hear Aaron Banks talking about Westminster. What do you think about the parallels between those things?
Yes and no. I mean, I think all of the kind of the politicians you were pointing to, we as kind of historians and academics who work in this area wouldn't see as fascist, but various anti-fascist campaigners today would see them as fascist. So, you know, sort of fascism in some ways can be, you know, what's in the eye of the beholder and so on. So it gets very complicated in those sorts of ways. Specifically for Donald Trump, for example, if after he'd got into power and become president, he'd shut down all political parties and initiated a one-party state and a kind of a transformation of that sort, we'd all perhaps very happily be calling him fascist. But I think what we can call him is far right, and there's a political scientist called Cass Muda who talks about, he's written a very good, very readable book called The Far Right Today that I'd recommend if you want a kind of a survey of this in Europe and America and so on. And all those others who you kind of talk about as well. I mean, they share with the kind of the fascisms past and present that sense of the other political parties are corrupted and are problematic and so on. We call that populism. And fascists are very good populists too. You know, sort of Hitler and Mussolini and so on, they were very good populists. But they were also revolutionaries, whereas people like Trump or Farage or these other kind of figures, they're not offering a revolutionary vision. They have a sense of transformation, and within a democratic process, I think that should be heard as well. I don't want to, you know, sort of be anti-fascist and anti, you know, that kind of populist radical right necessarily, because even if we don't personally agree with that politics, within a democratic political system, that voice needs to be dealt with and not silenced too, and that can be a problem here. But there is something qualitatively different between those kind of clusters of figures and as I say, genuine fascists. If you go to Greece, for example, a party called Golden Dawn there, I mean, that was much more overtly influenced by Nazi themes and ideals. And as I say, the British National Party here, which was successful a few years ago, that was genuinely rooted in the same culture that I've talked about. So I would happily put that into the fascist box. But as I say, these other parties, or things like the Brexit Party or UKIP, they don't really fit in that regard. They're different again, and they're responding to newer themes. You talked about the issue of internationalism or nationalism, and this can be a real problem as well. A lot of the kind of the revolutionary fascist cultures of the post-war period has become much more racially focused than nationally focused, which lends itself to, you know, sort of greater kind of international networking. And there's been a lot of that. There's been a lot of it, but by very small groups. For example, I wrote a journal article on something called the World Union of National Socialists in the 1960s, which is a freebie. You should be able to kind of Google that and find it online and read the whole thing if you want to. It's about 11,000 words long. It's very dry, but if it's your sort of thing that you want to read that, then you can. But again, you know, sort of a tiny network in the 1960s made up of small, you know, bands of groups of tens, maybe hundreds at best in various parts of the world. Fascist internationalism often falls down when you've got two countries together, especially they've got some sort of border dispute. You know, Hungary and Romania, for example, are kind of a very good example of this, but there are lots of other examples too. If they're further apart, then it's easier for them to agree how both their countries can be greater versions of what they currently are. But border disputes can be really interesting and really problematic. And also, although fascism has a kind of a broad vision of regenerating the nation, exactly how to do that is something they all disagree on too. Again, just one example from what I was talking about. Mosley and Arnold Lees were both anti-Semitic conspiracy theorists, but they had different ideas on what that all was about, so there wasn't compatibility there. But anyway, that's enough. Maybe there's some other questions that can come in.
We have a question from Richard Bornat, I think. Richard, go ahead.
Well, it's actually not Richard, it's Joanna who's sitting
Hello,
next.
Joanna.
It's kind of double-barreled question. I wondered whether you could sort of think about the ways in which British fascism and movements of that kind link to other social groupings. For example, the people who wanted to bring Hess over, who tried to actually bring Hess over, were upper class, they were aristocrats, and British fascism had some significant links there. And class in society. Post-war, you've got another kind of, it's a social movement set, in a sense. You've got the British Union of Ex-Servicemen. So the link between the military and fascism is, I would have thought, important. But I also wonder, in this sort of the struggles with the ex-servicemen, whether the activities of the 43 group might not have had some presence in Finsbury Park, although of course mostly they were active in Hackney, around Dalston.
Well, what brilliant questions. Thank you for that. I mean, you mentioned a couple of very interesting groups and this kind of theme of military as well. And I'll come back to that in just a second. But this kind of theme of class is very interesting. And as I say, you know, sort of older approaches to fascism kind of saw it as a middle class phenomenon. You know, the angry middle classes were kind of developing a kind of a radical form of politics. But newer approaches to fascism does see it as kind of something that appeals across different class bases, but sometimes in rather odd ways. And there was one organisation or kind of set of organisations that Dan Stone wrote an article on called The English Mystery and the English Array, and that had a kind of a small, very elite, very upper class element and a very working class element. It was very difficult for them to kind of connect and mesh the two. I also teach about the Nazi regime as on a module I teach on the history of fascism, and we kind of go through some work by a historian called Detlef Mühlberger, who did lots of social work on the German Nazi Party. I got this really fascinating book chapter that takes people through a kind of a tour of all these different, you know, sort of Nazi sub-parties at the early 1930s, some rural ones that are full of farmers, some other city ones that have got a much more a diverse base and things. So these kind of issues about who forms fascist movements are very interesting, and it's certainly one that historians are very alert to, along with this theme, and I've tried to pull out people like Julie Gottlieb as well, about the gender dynamic as well, and there's very often very interesting gender things going on within fascist organisations that's more than just hypermasculinity, but there's a lot of that there. The League of Ex-Servicemen, again, is a really interesting organisation, and in a way, as I say, it's a group that was developed in the late 30s and became led by somebody called Geoffrey Ham into the 1940s. And this became a vehicle which rehabilitated Mosley in the later 1940s as well. So this was a very interesting organisation to see. And there's quite a lot of interesting records in the National Archives, because there's quite a lot of monitoring of potential fascists in the late 1940s as well, that kind of picks up this theme of people leaving the services in various ways. This neo-Nazi figure I wrote a book on, Colin Jordan, for example, he was a younger serviceman, and during his time in service, in the army, he'd been picked up in various ways and commented on, and I've got some files that one time I want to write a journal article on that will kind of plot that pathway out of the army and into fascism. And the 43 group as well is another really interesting anti-fascist organisation, which is just worth flagging up for people who aren't aware of it. But this was a Jewish militant anti-fascist group of the 1940s that campaigned against the growth of fascism after 1945 in various ways, criticised by more conservative voices in the Jewish community for, again, feeling that its militancy and its aggressive oppositional approach was creating more problems than it was solving as well, and helped create a culture that later fed into groups like Searchlight and others, and also in some ways influenced, from speaking with people connected with that, anti-fascist communities we've got some connections with as well, also taking influence and inspiration from European resistance movements as well, and seeing some of their activities as broadly cognate to the sorts of things that they wanted to do. But lots of very interesting stuff from the 43 group, and there has been new work on it. I'm just trying to see if I can find the book that I haven't read yet, but there's a new book on the 43 group that is very good and very, very readable too. I can't find it to hand to kind of flag up the title, but the 43 group, again, a very interesting example of British anti-fascism. So I hope that addresses some of your points, and absolutely in terms of social classes and social backgrounds being very important, and the themes of how leaving wars, relationship between the two world wars and the ways in which fascism develops is very important to think about.
Thank you very much. Is there anybody who's got another question? And while you think about that, and if you just want to wave or do whatever, if you can't find the raised hand, then feel free or unmute yourself. But while you do that, I just want to come back on this question of the line that you draw as an academic, Paul, between fascists and the extreme right, or the, shall we say, the more mainstream extreme right. And I do understand that. But if you look at fascism in the UK, I mean, is it, you know, it hasn't really been centre stage since Margaret Hodge saw off Nick Griffin in 2010. I think that was, you know, it's not really, the burden has shifted to other parties who are carrying the same banner. And I'm just wondering, you know, now a lot of people sense that there are parallels between what was happening in the 30s and now. So where are the things that we need to be most concerned about now if we look at what happened with fascism in the 30s and what is happening here now in 2010?
Online, I think, would be the answer. And also, I'll come back to that, I'll unpack that in a second, but I think one of the things to think about is not the fascist organisation, it's not the BUF. It's important to think about the ways in which fascist and the extreme right kind of merge and mutate with each other through a variety of organisations which have got different qualities about them. As I say, the ones that you were pointing to, they're mainstream, or tend to be mainstream political parties, and they thrive better with having an ambiguous approach to whether they accept or tolerate racism. Trump would be a very good example here, rather than a kind of a full, you know, sort of Hitler style, you know, sort of nail my colours to the mast. There's an ambiguity that they will often present that allow people to project what they want to onto them, and that offers them greater success. And those sorts of political parties also are not, let's say, proposing the sort of revolutionary changes to constitutions and so on that we would expect from fascism. The question about whether they've helped to normalise and make more acceptable a set of prejudices that then are picked up by other groups that operate on their fringe that they might formally disassociate themselves from is a different matter. So, as I say, talking about the group can be a little bit narrow, if you see what I mean. You've got to see the culture and the way different groups interact and create a culture. So I think at the moment we've seen the populist radical right, not the fascist far right, become more politically successful. Whether that's creating opportunities in the medium to longer term for more extreme politics to become more acceptable in its wake is perhaps an open question. I mean, right at the moment, we've seen a lot of that take a bit of a kicking with the sudden and, to my mind, very heartening rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. But whether that has a lasting impact or whether that's just a short-term, you know, sort of thing, I think is again yet to be seen. And it's for people connected with that particular social movement to also make, you know, it into something more substantial. So in terms of international impact and so on, because I mean, for a lot of people in the UK, Black Lives Matter is a relatively new movement. When it was founded, it emerged in America, you know, sort of 7-8 years ago. I can't do my math properly, but you know, it's been going for a little while. So, as I say, my point, first of all, is to think about the community of organisations that create, have a spectrum of different politics to them. Don't look for one kind of organisation that's the one to be worried about. And that's really difficult to get your head around because there's lots of them and they're always changing. Online, if you go into the online space, then you will find some of the most extreme stuff in various ways, every bit as extreme as the material you would found in interwar fascist organisations too. Websites like 4chan and various other, some of them are kind of anonymous kind of chat boards spaces where you can say stuff without, you know, sort of seeming to have any consequences, that helps fuel amongst some, you know, very extreme views in various ways, for example, and the use of social media to then, you know, sort of have an impact on a wider audience. You know, groups in Britain like Britain First, for example, which emerged out of the British Union of Fascists, was for a while very successful on Facebook about getting people to share memes that it was creating without them necessarily knowing much what the organisation itself was about. But that's being curtailed more and more by social media organizations. But nonetheless, there is a vibrant and complex online world where there's all sorts of stuff going on. And in terms of large-scale mass political movements, it's not about to foster one of those, but it is fostering things like lone actor terrorism. Let's go back to Finsbury Park, for example. I mean, Darren Osborne was radicalised in particular by things like materials from Tommy Robinson, and he's a very effective online communicator and operator in the social media space. He's become much more impactful since leaving his large-scale street organisation and being just a kind of a lone voice, but with a huge network. So the online space is creating new forms of extremism. And as I say, that might not be about to enter power, but then there's also a populist radical right that's becoming more successful and impactful. But there is a kind of a threat of extreme violence as well that's important to consider from those sorts of sources. Does that sort of help to make sense of some of this? But if your question also is, what's the one thing to look out for? My answer to you is, there's not one thing, it's everything if you're wanting to be concerned about this. And if you say, well, that's too complicated, I suppose I say, well, tough, it's that's the nature of the problem.
Sadly, I'm sure you're right. I mean, it is salutary to us here in Finsbury Park to know that, currently people are accusing Black Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter and Antifa as being the troublemakers, shall we say, and that has an echo back in the Islington and Holloway press, no less, and it was going then. But anyway, I think we have reached the end of our time now, Paul. I just want to thank you very, very much for an absolutely fascinating talk. I'm really delighted that so many people have actually stayed the course right through this fascinating talk. Thank you very much indeed. And that's the end of today's talk.